You know, usually when you get a save the date card in the mail, it completely changes your relationship to the future event.
Right.
Like if a friend sends you a wedding invitation for a date that is, I don't know, 3 years away,
Yeah,
you might stick it on the fridge, but you basically just go about your normal life.
absolutely. You just file it away.
Yeah, you aren't packing your bags, you aren't buying a suit yet, and you certainly aren't waiting by the door.
No, of course not.
But let's say your spouse is 9 months pregnant.
Oh, wow. Yeah, that is a whole different ballgame.
Right. And the doctor says, the baby could arrive literally any second.
You're on high alert.
Completely.
Yeah.
In that scenario, your bags are by the door. You sleep with one eye open. You basically jump at every little sound.
Yeah, you do.
The certainty of a distant date breeds this kind of passive waiting. But the imminence of an unknown hour, well, that creates a state of really active, urgent preparation.
That psychological reality dictates our daily posture. We just behave very differently when we know an event is, centuries off compared to when we believe it could happen at any moment.
We really do.
When you believe something is imminent, it consumes your thoughts. It dictates your priorities.
Yeah.
But when you relegate an event to the distant future, it becomes this abstract concept rather than a present reality.
Yeah,
And that human tendency is right at the core of what we're looking at today.
it really is. So, welcome to a new deep dive on reformed thinking. Today, our mission is to look closely at a truly fascinating historical text by Jonathan Edwards.
Yes, from 1747.
Right, published in 1747, and it has quite the title. It's called Extraordinary Prayer for the Revival of Religion and the Advancement of Christ's Kingdom on Earth.
It's a classic Edwards title for sure.
Yeah, very descriptive. But we are zeroing in on a very specific, and I would say highly debated, section of this text. Edwards is writing a direct rebuttal to an objection raised by a respected commentator named Mr. Moses Lowman.
All right, Lowman was a very well-regarded scholar at the time.
He was. And Lowman had done all the math on biblical prophecy and claimed that the fall of the Antichrist and the subsequent coming of Christ's kingdom on earth was just centuries away.
Centuries.
Yeah. Specifically, Lowman started it would not happen until sometime after the year 2000.
Wow.
And Edwards steps up and just forcefully pushes back against this timeline.
He really does. And we should clarify why this matters for you, the listener. Because at first glance, if you were sitting in the 21st century, you might think, well, the year 2000 has already passed, so Lowman was obviously wrong.
Right. It's easy to look back and say that.
Exactly. You might think this is just a dusty academic debate about historical dates and, esoteric prophetic math from the 18th century.
Which would be boring.
Right. But it isn't about retroactively grading 18th century math.
Mm-hmm.
This is about how our expectations of the future fundamentally shape our spiritual lives, our prayers, and our actions today.
That is the real issue.
Edwards understood that if you convince a whole generation of believers that the victory of Christ's kingdom is hundreds of years away, you basically extinguish the urgency of their prayers.
You turn them into people staring at a save the date card on the fridge.
Yes, precisely. Instead of people waiting by the door.
I am so thrilled to have you here as our guide to unpack all the historical and theological arguments Edwards makes. Because he doesn't just dismiss Lowman out of hand, does he?
No, not at all. He respects Lowman.
Right. But he completely dismantles Lowman's arguments using scripture, logic, and just a massive amount of historical data. So let's start by examining the practical problem first.
Let's do it.
Lowman argues that the 1,260 years of the Antichrist's reign, which is a number pulled straight from the book of Revelation, began in the year 756 A.D.
756, right.
So if you do the basic addition, 756 plus 1,260, you cross the threshold of the year 2000.
It's simple arithmetic.
Right. And Edwards points out a massive issue with this. He says, if this distant date were an absolute certainty, it would contradict God's explicit commands to the church regarding how they're supposed to pray.
Yeah, to understand Lowman's starting point, we have to look briefly at what happened in that specific year, 756 AD.
Okay, set the scene for us.
Lowman didn't just pull that number out of thin air. That was the year of the donation of Pepin.
Pepin the Short, right.
Yes, Pepin the Short, the king of the Franks. He conquered a significant portion of Italy and officially handed the territory over to Pope Stephen II.
Oh, wow. So he gave land directly to the Pope.
He did. And this established the Papal States. For theologians like Lowman, this was the exact moment the Pope transitioned from just a spiritual leader to a temporal, earthly monarch.
A king, basically.
Right, a ruler with actual land and armies. It was the moment the beast fully established its earthly kingdom, in their view. So Lowman plants his flag right there in the year 756 and starts the 1260-year countdown clock.
That context is incredibly helpful because it makes Lowman's math look very logical on paper.
It does. It makes a lot of historical sense.
But Edwards sets up this real theological dilemma for Lowman. He says, okay, let's assume your date is right.
Let's pretend he's correct.
Yeah, let's assume it is the revealed will of God that the church should be in extraordinary prayer for the fall of the Antichrist, crying out, "How long, Lord?" and pleading for him to come quickly.
Which is a biblical command.
Right. So Edwards asks, is it reasonable to think God would first reveal the precise, unalterable, distant date through Mr. Lowman, and then turn around and command the church to urgently plead for it to happen speedily?
It's a huge contradiction.
It really creates a massive contradiction in God's nature. God would be asking the church to eagerly seek something they know for an absolute fact is hundreds of years away.
It creates a scenario where God is essentially asking his people to engage in an exercise of futility. And Edwards argues that God does not mock his church. If God commands us to pray for the speedy arrival of his kingdom, it means the arrival is genuinely impending from our perspective.
It has to be a real possibility.
Exactly. It means our prayers have a real immediate function. If Lowman's timeline is correct, and the entire church in the year 1747 knows that the event won't happen for another 250 years.
Then praying for it to happen speedily just feels totally disingenuous.
It does. It feels fake.
It brings us back to waiting at the train station. If the station master comes out and tells you, with absolute ironclad certainty, that the train will not arrive for 3 weeks.
We're going home.
Yeah. You are not going to stand on the platform peering down the tracks. You aren't going to eagerly cry out for the train to arrive now.
You'd look crazy if you did.
You would. You will go home. You will go to sleep. You will come back in 3 weeks.
Right.
Edwards is basically asking, how can we reconcile the biblical command to be watchful with Lowman's rigid, distant timeline? If we know the time is far off, why should we follow the command to go speedily and pray before the Lord?
And Edwards roots this practical argument in the words of Christ himself. He points to the book of Acts, chapter 1, verses 6 and 7.
What happens there?
The disciples are literally asking Jesus for the timeline. They want to know when the kingdom will be restored to Israel. And Christ explicitly tells them, it is not for you to know the times and the seasons which the Father hath put in his own control.
He shuts it down.
He shuts the whole inquiry down. Edwards argues there is no logical reason to think the timeline is any more available to us today than it was to the apostles then.
Right.
God commands believers to maintain a posture of constant preparation. He uses the biblical imagery of servants waiting for the coming of their Lord.
Or the virgins waiting for the bridegroom.
Yes, not knowing at what hour he will come. Establishing a precise, distant date destroys that specific posture of eager anticipation.
So, really, the unknown nature of the timeline is a feature, not a bug.
That's a great way to put it.
It is entirely designed to keep the church awake, active, and persistent in prayer. If you give the church a calendar with the date circled 300 years in the future, the church goes to sleep.
We see this human flaw all the time, don't we?
Oh, absolutely. When deadlines are far away, procrastination sets in immediately. God designed the mystery of the end times to combat spiritual procrastination.
Spot on.
So, from the practical posture of the believer, Edwards moves to the actual scriptural text regarding sealed prophecies. Because Lowman basically claimed to have cracked the code that everyone else missed.
He did, and Edwards brings in the book of Daniel, specifically chapter 12, to challenge that claim directly.
Let's dig into Daniel then.
In this chapter, Daniel receives this massive, sweeping vision concerning a future time of great trouble for the church. And the angel tells Daniel, shut up the words and seal the book, even to the time of the end.
So it's supposed to be a secret.
Exactly. But Daniel, being naturally inquisitive and, wanting to understand the fate of his people, here's a timeline given.
What's the timeline he hears?
The angel says it will be for a time, times, and a half. Daniel admits he hears it, but he doesn't understand what it means.
I mean, I don't blame him.
Right. So he asks the angel to clarify the timeline, and the angel gives him a gentle rebuke, very similar to the one Christ gave the disciples in Acts.
What does the angel say?
The angel says, go thy way, Daniel. The words are closed and sealed up till the time of the end.
I want to pause here and look closely at the math for a second because we can't assume everyone listening knows how a time times and a half equals 1,260
Oh,
years.
yeah, we should definitely break that down.
How did 18th century theologians get from point A to point B? Because that seems like quite a leap.
It is a crucial clarification. So, in the prophetic language of the Bible, a time generally refers to 1 year, based on a 360-day lunar calendar.
Okay, a time is 1 year.
Right. Times is plural, meaning 2 years. And half means half a year. So you have 1 year plus 2 years plus half a year.
Which equals 3.5 years.
Spot on. Now, if you multiply 3.5 years by 360 days per year, you get exactly 1,260 days.
Okay, the math tracks so far. But those are days, not years.
This is where it gets interesting. Theologians apply what is called the day-year principle, which is derived from passages in Numbers and Ezekiel, where God explicitly says, I have appointed thee each day for a year.
Oh, I see.
So the 1,260 days become 1,260 prophetic years. That is the underlying math that Lowman, Edwards, and honestly, almost all of their contemporaries agreed upon.
Okay, so they entirely agree on the duration.
They do.
The conflict is entirely about the starting line. Where does the clock start ticking? And this raises an incredibly vital point about interpreting prophecy. Edwards uses a very tight logical progression here.
He really traps Lowman with logic.
He does. He says, if God explicitly told Daniel that this specific timeline is kept as a great secret until the actual time of the end arrives, and that all attempts to figure it out beforehand will be in vain,
Yeah.
then any theologian, no matter how learned or ingenious, who claims to have unsealed it and pinpointed the precise year is highly likely to be mistaken.
It's a bold claim for anyone to make.
Right. He is basically saying, Mr. Lowman, you are claiming to have opened a book that God himself said would remain sealed.
It acts as a profound theological check, a heavy theological check on human arrogance.
For sure.
Edwards is actually very respectful of Lowman as a scholar. He acknowledges Lowman's commentary is well written and provides immense light on other parts of Revelation.
He's not just attacking the man.
No, not at all. But on this specific issue of calculating the timeline, Edwards draws a hard line. The logic is so straightforward. If the mystery is divinely sealed, human intellect cannot forcefully unseal it ahead of schedule.
It's just not possible.
Right. Edwards believes the phrase, a time, times and a half, refers to the same period as the 1,260 years of the Antichrist's reign, the time the true church is hiding in the wilderness.
Okay.
And since Daniel, one of the greatest prophets in history, was told to rest contented in ignorance of this matter, we should be highly skeptical of anyone who claims they have calculated the precise finish line.
You know, I have to ask a theological question on behalf of the listener here.
Sure, go ahead.
When I read that argument, I think, okay, but if we aren't supposed to know the timeline, why did God put these exact numbers in the text at all?
That is the million-dollar question.
Right. Why give us a time, times and a half, or 1,260 days if we are just supposed to remain ignorant? It feels like giving someone an intricate riddle, but forbidding them from trying to solve it. What is the function of the numbers if not to be calculated?
That is the natural human reaction, definitely. But Edwards clarifies the function of the numbers beautifully. He argues that there is a massive difference between knowing general signs of an approaching event and pinpointing the precise date.
Okay, general signs versus precise dates.
Right. He uses the Jewish anticipation of the Messiah as his primary example. The Jews in the Old Testament had Daniel's prophecy of the 70 weeks.
So they had a timeline too.
They did. And they knew, based on those numbers, that the time of the Messiah's arrival was drawing near. It created a general climate of expectation.
We definitely see that in the Gospels.
Yeah, we see this in the New Testament with people like Simeon and Anna who were actively looking for the redemption of Jerusalem and the temple.
They were waiting by the door.
Exactly. But they didn't know the precise day or year. The numbers are given to assure the church that the period of suffering is measured, it is finite, and God is completely in control.
So it's about comfort.
Yes, it provides immense comfort that the reign of the enemy is limited to this specific symbolic duration.
Ah, so it is an intentional blind spot. God gives the church a time frame to establish boundaries for suffering.
That's a great way to summarize it.
If you are a persecuted believer, knowing that the beast has a designated expiration date gives you the stamina to endure. But God hides the exact mathematical starting point to prevent apathy.
Precisely. Knowing the general season is beneficial, but pinpointing the specific date is forbidden because that mystery fuels persistent faith and urgent prayer.
Okay, so Edwards has established that Lowman's timeline is practically discouraging and biblically suspect based on the Book of Daniel.
He laid the groundwork.
Now, we shift into the really intense historical and textual debate. This brings us to Revelation chapter 17, the dissecting of the beast, and specifically the legacy of the Roman Emperor Constantine.
This is where Edwards' analytical skills and historical knowledge just take center stage.
Oh, it's fascinating.
Revelation chapter 17 describes a beast with 7 successive heads. The angel explains the vision to John, saying the 7 heads represent 7 mountains, but also 7 kings or forms of government.
Yeah. 7 forms of Roman government.
Right. The text explicitly says, 5 are fallen, 1 is, and the other is not yet come. And when he comes, he must continue a short space. Then there is an 8th, which is of the 7, and goes into perdition.
It sounds like a riddle.
It does. And the theological debate over the centuries centers on who these heads represent in actual Roman history.
Let's break down the consensus first, because they did agree on some of it.
They did. Most Protestant commentators agreed on the first 6 heads.
Right. The 5 that had fallen by the time John wrote Revelation were the kings, the consuls, the dictators, the decemvirs, and the military tribunes.
Those were the previous forms of Roman government, yes.
And the one that is present during John's life was the imperial head, the ruling Caesars.
Spot on. The massive disagreement between Lowman and Edwards is identifying the 7th head.
The one that has not yet come and must continue a short space before the Antichrist arises.
Exactly. Lowman argued that the 7th head represented the Gothic princes and the Exarchate of Ravenna.
And we definitely need to explain what the Exarchate of Ravenna was, so the listener can follow Lowman's logic here, because that's an obscure piece of history.
It really is. After the western half of the Roman Empire fell in 476 AD, the Byzantine Empire, which was the eastern half of the Roman Empire, based in Constantinople, eventually recaptured parts of Italy.
Okay, so the East takes back some of the West.
Right. And they established a center of government in the city of Ravenna to rule over their Italian territories. This Byzantine outpost was called the Exarchate of Ravenna.
Got it.
Lowman argued that this specific governing body, along with the Gothic princes who briefly ruled, constituted the 7th head of the beast. They filled the gap between the fall of the Caesars and the rise of the papacy in 756 AD.
But Edwards fiercely disagrees with this historical mapping.
Fiercely.
Edwards argues that the skipped 7th head, the one the biblical text notes with such distinction, is not some minor Byzantine outpost. He argues the 7th head is actually Constantine and the Christian emperors.
Which is a huge claim.
It is, and his reasoning here is incredibly compelling. He points out the absurdity of Lowman's categorization. Just look at how the beast is described in Revelation.
It's terrifying.
It's a monstrous entity. It's compared to a leopard, a bear, a lion. It is covered in names of blasphemy. It gets its absolute authority from the red dragon, which the text identifies as the devil.
Yeah.
It is bloody, cruel, and noted specifically for persecuting the Christian church.
Right. So keeping that description in mind, Edward says, look at Constantine.
Look at his actual life.
Constantine was not a persecutor of the church. He was its great protector. He legalized Christianity. He ended the state-sponsored slaughter of believers.
He changed everything for them.
He was the instrument God used to deliver the church from the persecuting force of that very beast. Even Lowman himself acknowledged Constantine as a Christian prince in his own writings.
Which makes Lowman's argument kind of contradictory.
It does. So Edwards asks a devastating logical question. Why on earth would the Holy Spirit reckon Constantine and the Christian emperors as proper members, as literal heads of a blasphemous, bloody beast aligned with the devil?
It creates a massive textual and theological contradiction.
It really does.
I have to stop you there, though, and play devil's advocate for a second.
Sure.
If you are a modern student of church history, you might look at Constantine and say, wait a minute, didn't Constantine fuse church and state power? Didn't he introduce a level of wealth and political influence that eventually corrupted the church?
That is a very common modern critique.
Right. Many Reformed thinkers point to the Constantinian shift as the beginning of the end for the early church's purity. So how can Edwards argue Constantine is the good guy here and not a head of the corrupt beast?
That is an excellent historical objection, and Edwards actually anticipates this tension. Edwards is not arguing that Constantine was a perfect, flawless Christian. or that the church under his reign was perfectly pure. What Edwards is arguing is a matter of primary biblical alignment. In the specific apocalyptic imagery of Revelation, the beast exists to slaughter the saints.
That's its whole job.
Right. It is entirely animated by hostility toward Christ. Whatever flaws Constantine had, his primary historical function was ending the centuries of martyrdom.
He stopped the blood from flowing.
He stopped the slaughter. He convened the Council of Nicaea to defend Orthodox theology against the Arian heresy. From the perspective of a persecuted church hiding in the catacombs, Constantine was a deliverer.
That makes a lot of sense.
Edwards is arguing that God categorizes leaders based on their primary relationship to his people. You do not place the man who sought the executions on the organizational chart of the executioners.
That makes perfect sense. It is like listing the chief of police as one of the heads of a mafia family.
That's a perfect analogy.
You just do not put the guy fighting the organization on their own leadership roster. Constantine fought the dragon. He wasn't a member of it. Edwards goes even deeper into Scripture to prove God's character in this regard. He points out that God is exceedingly careful not to reckon his own people among the visible subjects of Satan.
He pulls from all over the Bible to prove this.
He does. He cites the book of Numbers, where Balaam prophesies over Israel, saying, "The people shall dwell alone and shall not be reckoned among the nations." He cites Revelation chapter 8, where idolatrous tribes are explicitly left out of the sealing of the 144,000.
And the genealogies, too.
Yes. He notes the genealogy of Christ in Matthew chapter 1, where certain kings of Judah noted for gross idolatry are deliberately skipped over and left out of the list.
That pattern is the foundation of his argument. God meticulously marks his people. He separates them from the wicked.
So he wouldn't lump Constantine in with the beast.
Exactly. So, when calculating the successive heads of the Roman Empire, when the timeline reaches Constantine and the Christian emperors, God essentially skips them. He puts a mark of distinction on them, signaling they do not belong to the beast. Therefore, the Antichrist, the papal authority, while technically the 8th head chronologically in Roman history, is reckoned as the 7th head of the beast itself.
Okay, I follow the logic.
Edwards says this is the most just and natural interpretation of the text. Furthermore, he argues that if you make Constantine ahead of the beast, you also make him ahead of the red dragon in chapter 12.
Because the beast and the dragon share the same 7 heads.
Yes, they do.
Right. And in Revelation chapter 12, there is a cosmic war between the dragon and the woman, clothed with the sun, who represents the true church.
And whose side was Constantine on?
Constantine fought on the side of the woman. He was the main historical instrument of victory over the pagan dragon. To say he is simultaneously ahead of the dragon he is defeating is completely nonsensical.
It just doesn't work.
Yeah.
Edwards even points out a fascinating detail about geography here.
Oh, about moving the capital.
Yeah. God, in his providence, had Constantine move the seat of the empire away from Rome to Constantinople. He literally abandoned the city of 7 hills, leaving Rome vacant to eventually become the seat of the papal beast.
It is such a comprehensive historical and theological takedown of Lowman's framework.
It's brilliant. And this disagreement completely changes how they interpret the famous deadly wound mentioned in Revelation chapter 13.
Right, the deadly wound.
The text says John saw one of the heads of the beast, quote, as it were wounded to death, and his deadly wound was healed. Lowman thought the deadly wound was the fall of the Christian Roman Empire to the barbarian Goths in the 5th century.
So Lowman thought the barbarians were the sword striking the beast.
Yes, but Edwards reinterprets this entirely. He argues the deadly wound was not the fall of Christian Rome. It was the death of the heathen Roman Empire through the conversion of the emperor.
That is a massive paradigm shift.
It changes everything.
The beast was wounded to death when the empire stopped being pagan and became Christian. And Edwards notes that the sword that dealt this deadly wound was not the physical, literal sword of the invading Goths.
No, it wasn't a physical sword at all.
He connects it to the imagery in Revelation chapters 1 and 19, where the sword proceeds out of the mouth of Christ. It was the word of Christ, the preaching of the gospel, the spiritual strength of the early church that converted Constantine and delivered the mortal blow to the heathen empire.
Which aligns perfectly when you consider the nature of the beast.
How so?
Well, the beast's entire purpose is to persecute the church. Therefore, a wound to the beast must logically be a relief to the church.
Oh, that makes so much sense.
But Lowman's interpretation that the wound was the barbarian invasion was actually a total disaster for the Christian church in the West. The Goths sacked Rome, destroyed churches, and plunged the region into chaos.
So a disaster for the church can't be a wound to the beast.
Exactly. How could a disaster for the church be considered a wound to the church's enemy? Edwards aligns the symbolism with the spiritual reality. The wound was the magnificent victory of the gospel over entrenched paganism.
And then the healing of the wound.
The healing of the wound happened later when the Antichrist arose,
Hmm.
bringing back the idolatry and persecution under a new pseudo-Christian disguise.
And Edwards does not stop there. He goes relentlessly after Lowman's timeline discrepancies regarding the seventh head.
He really holds Lowman's feet to the fire on the timeline.
The biblical text explicitly states that the seventh head must continue a short space. But let's look at Lowman's proposed seventh head, the Gothic princes and the Exarchate of Ravenna.
Let's do the math again.
They ruled Italy from the fall of Rome in 476 AD until the donation of Pepin in 756 AD. That is nearly 300 years.
It's a long time.
In the context of Roman history, 300 years is one of the longest reigns of any governing form. It's not a short space at all.
Not even close.
Furthermore, Lowman struggles with the phrase regarding the 10 kings who received power 1 hour with the beast.
Yes, Lowman places the moment the 10 kingdoms of Europe arose at the division of the empire, around 456 AD. But Lowman says the Antichrist's reign, the beast's authority, didn't begin until 756 AD.
So there's a huge gap.
That creates a 300-year gap between the kings receiving their kingdoms and the beast taking the throne. Edwards points out that biblically, the phrase 1 hour signifies a very brief, concurrent point in time.
It means they happen together.
Right. It means they receive their crowns at the same hour or near the exact same point in history. I mean, the time from Christ's ascension to the conversion of Constantine was roughly 300 years. It is an impossible stretch of the biblical language to say 1 hour actually means 3 entire centuries.
So by dismantling Lowman's historical starting point, pointing out the absurdity of the short space lasting 3 centuries, and rescuing Constantine from the ranks of the dragon,
He really does tear it all down.
Edwards effectively demolishes the idea that the year 2000 is the absolute finish line. He opens the door to his own view of how biblical prophecy unfolds. He rejects the idea that the Antichrist's reign is on this distant, untouchable timeline.
And this brings us to Edwards' own perspective, which is a far more organic historical view. He says the fall of the anti-Christian kingdom is a gradual progression.
It's not just one event.
No. He argues the apostate church didn't rise to authority all at once on a single day in history, and it will not fall all at once either. The destruction happens in distinct, observable steps.
This is a vital pivot in Edwards' theology. He moves from defensive critique to constructive interpretation. He introduces the vials of wrath from Revelation chapter 16, specifically focusing on the sixth vial.
The vials are key to his whole argument here.
The text says the sixth angel poured out his vial upon the great river Euphrates, and the water thereof was dried up, that the way of the kings of the east might be prepared. Edwards insists we have to take this specific imagery in connection with all the other vials.
Right, they're all connected judgments.
The vials are judgments poured out on the beast and his kingdom, which Revelation explicitly calls Babylon the Great, or mystical Babylon.
I find this section absolutely gripping because it grounds these wild apocalyptic images of Revelation in actual gritty Old Testament history. Edwards connects the mystical river Euphrates in Revelation to the literal physical river Euphrates that flowed through ancient historical Babylon.
The actual river in Iraq.
Yes. To understand his point, we have to look back at the story of Cyrus the Great, the Persian king, who conquered literal Babylon in 539 BC.
Set the scene for ancient Babylon for us.
Babylon was considered the most impregnable city in the ancient world. The walls were reported to be 300 feet high and 80 feet thick.
That is massive.
It's unbelievable. You could drive chariots around the top of the walls. You could not batter them down. You could not starve the city out because they had years of provisions stored inside.
And they had water, right.
Exactly. The actual river Euphrates ran right through the center of the city, providing a constant, inexhaustible water supply.
So King Belshazzar of Babylon felt so secure behind those walls that while Cyrus's army was camped outside, Belshazzar threw a massive feast.
Right, he was totally unbothered.
We read about this in Daniel chapter 5, the famous story of the handwriting on the wall. But outside the city, Cyrus executed one of the most brilliant engineering feats in military history.
He really did.
He knew he couldn't breach the walls, so he took his army upstream out of sight of the city. He had his engineers dig massive trenches to divert the flow of the Euphrates into a nearby swamp.
He literally dried up the channel. He dropped the water level of a major river down to mid-thigh.
Which is insane to think about.
It is. And by doing that, he allowed his armies, who were from Media and Persia, which were located directly to the east of Babylon, making them literally the kings of the east.
Oh, the kings of the east.
Yes. He allowed them to walk silently through the muddy riverbed, right under the impregnable city gates, and conquer the city from the inside out while the Babylonians were drunk and feasting.
It was a silent, unexpected, catastrophic collapse.
It really was. And Edwards draws a direct thematic connection between this historical account and the prophetic text of Revelation. Just as the literal Euphrates had to be dried up for old Babylon to fall to the kings of the east, the mystical Euphrates must be dried up for the new mystical Babylon, the anti-Christian church, to fall.
It is a staggering parallel that highlights the consistency of biblical imagery.
It's so consistent.
The drying of the literal river was the absolute last major action taken by the besieging army before Old Babylon was completely destroyed. In the exact same way, the pouring out of the sixth vial, the drying of the mystical river, is the last major vial poured out before the final total destruction of mystical Babylon by the seventh vial.
The parallels are just undeniable.
So the obvious question for the theologian analyzing this text becomes, what exactly does this mystical river Euphrates represent in the spiritual landscape of the church?
Edwards concludes that it represents the wealth, the revenues, the temporal supplies, and the worldly incomes of the Church of Rome.
It's all about the money.
It is. And he doesn't just offer this as a creative guess. He proves it using a massive amount of scripture. He goes deep into the prophets, Isaiah, Hosea, and Jeremiah.
Because waters means something specific in prophecy, right?
Right. In ancient prophetic language, waters constantly symbolize physical provision, vast wealth, and military supplies.
Yeah.
He quotes Isaiah chapter 5, where the prophet warns of judgment, saying, "Their multitude dried up with thirst."
Meaning they lost their wealth.
Exactly. This doesn't mean they simply needed a drink of water. It means they were entirely deprived of the supplies of life and prosperity. He quotes Hosea chapter 13. "His spring shall become dry, and his fountain shall be dried up. He shall spoil the treasure of all pleasant vessels."
Oh, notice how the drying of the water is immediately equated with the spoiling of treasure.
Yes. Even in the explicit prophecies about the fall of old Babylon, Jeremiah says, "A sword is upon her treasures, a drought is upon her waters." The waters and the treasures are explicitly linked in the prophetic mind.
Edwards argues that the wealth and the vast incomes of the papal dominions are the literal waters that nourish and support this spiritual city.
They absolutely are.
During the Middle Ages and into the early modern period, the ecclesiastics possessed a massive portion of the wealth in European territories. You had tithes, the sale of indulgences, Peter's pence, and massive land holdings.
It was a fortune.
These revenues flowed into the papal palace from innumerable distant countries, constantly replenishing the treasury, just like a great unending river.
It is a brilliant military strategy applied to spiritual warfare. If you want to defeat a massive empire, you don't just attack the thickest part of the walls, you cut off the supply lines.
You follow the money.
You follow the money. Drying up the financial and material resources leaves the false church completely defenseless. It removes their ability to fund armies, influence kings, and project their influence.
And to highlight this, Edwards sets up a beautiful poetic contrast between two distinct cities and two distinct rivers found in Revelation.
The tale of two rivers.
The tale of two rivers, yeah. He contrasts the New Jerusalem, representing the true, pure Church of Christ, with the mystical Babylon.
What river does the New Jerusalem have?
The New Jerusalem has the river of life running directly through the center of it. This signifies divine supplies, the abundant spiritual provision, the grace and the presence of the Holy Spirit for God's people. It echoes the river in the Garden of Eden that watered the plants, bringing genuine spiritual life.
That's beautiful. And on the other hand, the mystical Babylon has the Euphrates.
Right.
Since Babylon is a carnal, worldly society, its river represents carnal, worldly wealth. It satisfies only carnal desires. It buys political favors and earthly luxury.
It's entirely fleshly.
Right. When these streams of revenues and riches are dried up, Edwards says her walls will essentially be broken down. She will become incredibly weak and exposed to her enemies.
But the Euphrates didn't just act as a supply line bringing food and wealth. It also acted as a massive defensive moat around the city.
Right. The historical city of Babylon had a moat of prodigious width and depth, filled with the river's water, making access for enemy siege engines nearly impossible.
It was a huge physical barrier.
It was a barrier. So drying up the mystical Euphrates also means removing the defensive obstacles that protect the anti-Christian kingdom.
Edwards asks his readers to consider, what are these obstacles in the spiritual war? What has historically hindered the progress of true religion and protected the corrupt systems?
He identifies these defensive waters as corrupt doctrines, widespread doubts regarding true religion, and crucially, the intense divisions and contentions among Protestants themselves.
Oh, that's convicting.
It really is. These internal battles act as a defensive moat for the enemy. They are the things that prevent the true church from advancing. Removing these obstacles prepares the way for Christ's kingdom, much like leveling mountains and exalting valleys to build a road.
He links this directly to the famous imagery in Isaiah chapter 40. Prepare ye the way of the Lord, make straight in the desert a highway for our God.
Building the highway.
Yes, the drying up of rivers, the removing of stumbling blocks, making crooked things straight. This is all the preparatory work of the Spirit of God in history, unraveling intricacies in Christian doctrine, clearly distinguishing between true religion and false appearances, reforming wicked lives. All of this clears the highway for the church's latter-day glory.
What is so fascinating from a historical perspective is how Edwards viewed his own specific moment in history in light of this prophecy.
He didn't think this was some abstract event waiting to happen hundreds of years in the future, did he?
No, not at all. He genuinely believed the sixth vial was already beginning to be poured out in his lifetime. He looked closely at the geopolitical landscape of the 18th century and saw global wealth definitively moving away from Catholic nations and into Protestant hands.
He explicitly references the ships of Tarshish from the book of Isaiah, doesn't he?
He does. In the ancient world, the ships of Tarshish represented the pinnacle of global maritime trade and wealth. Edwards interpreted this as a prophecy about the gains of global trade and navigation shifting.
And you can see that in the history books.
Oh, absolutely. If you look at the era, the British and the Dutch, who were heavily Protestant, were beginning to completely dominate global trade, overshadowing the Spanish and Portuguese empires.
Right.
Edwards hoped the Spirit of God would influence these Protestant nations to devote this new, massive wealth, the silver and gold taken from their enemies, the merchandise flowing in from the East and West Indies to the service of God, making their economic strength holiness to the Lord.
And beyond the geopolitical shifts, he also pointed to the spiritual awakenings happening in his day as the start of this river drying process.
Edwards was heavily involved in the First Great Awakening, after all.
He was. He saw thousands of people converting. He saw genuine revival in his own town. However, he was remarkably intellectually honest. He noted that these revivals were currently mixed with what he called crudity and enthusiasm.
Yeah, he didn't pretend it was perfect.
There were false conversions, emotional excesses, and a lot of messy beginnings. But he didn't dismiss the revival because of the mess. He saw these events as the dawn, the early, imperfect beginnings of a far more pure and extensive revival that would eventually overthrow Satan's kingdom entirely.
This brings us to the really heavy pastoral conclusion of Edwards' entire argument. After laying out all this dense history, all this intricate prophetic interpretation, the math of Daniel, the beasts of Revelation, and all his optimism about the revivals of his day,
He shifts gears.
he turns and directly addresses the skeptic in his congregation. He essentially asks, what if I am totally wrong?
Wow.
Yeah. What if Mr. Lowman's math is actually right and the absolute ruin of the Antichrist is still centuries away? What if the year 2000 really is the finish line?
This section reveals that he is not just a rigid theological debater trying to win an argument. He is a pastor who cares intensely about the daily spiritual life of his readers.
He really does.
He says, even if the grand final fulfillment is far off, complying with the call to extraordinary prayer is never a waste of time. We have to remember the context of why he wrote this piece in the first place.
Right, the memorial from Scotland.
Yes, he was specifically promoting a memorial from Scotland, drafted in 1744. A group of Scottish ministers had proposed a 2-year concert of united prayer, specifically asking God for the outpouring of the Holy Spirit. Edwards was writing this book to convince American believers to join this movement and extend it for another 7 years.
It is a brilliantly constructed double-layered argument.
How so?
Layer 1. Lowman's math is highly suspect. It contradicts Scripture, it misreads Roman history, and therefore we should pray urgently because the time of victory might be very near.
Right.
Layer 2. Even if Lowman's math is perfectly right, and the end of the world as we know it is several hundred years away, Praying for revival right now brings immediate blessed tokens of God's acceptance.
He argues that believers who pray will see happy revivals of religion in their own local context, in their own time. They will receive spiritual blessings that richly recompense the pain and effort of extraordinary prayer.
God rewards the seeking.
Yes, God may not grant the final, greatest effusion of his spirit that completely destroys the beast tomorrow, but he will absolutely grant refreshing showers of grace today.
Believers get the conscious satisfaction of obeying Christ's explicit command to pray, and they get to witness the kingdom advancing in their own generation, even if they don't live to see the final victory.
It completely defangs Lowman's distant timeline as an excuse for spiritual apathy. Edwards proves that whether the timeline is short or long, whether the return of Christ is tomorrow or in 3 centuries, the mandate for the Christian is exactly the same. Earnest, constant, united prayer.
The chronological timeline should never dictate our daily obedience.
No, our obedience should be driven by God's command and the immediate pressing spiritual needs of our current time.
We have covered a massive amount of historical and theological ground today. We started by looking at the practical psychological danger of embracing a distant timeline for prophecy, realizing how easily it can lull the church to sleep.
We looked closely at the sealed book of Daniel, too.
Yeah, learning the day-year principle, but also recognizing the humility required when dealing with sealed mysteries. We dissected the intricate history of the Roman beast, rescuing the Emperor Constantine from the ranks of the dragon, and understanding the true nature of the deadly wound.
We examined the cinematic story of Cyrus the Great, understanding how the drying up of the literal Euphrates perfectly mirrors the drying up of the mystical Euphrates, the worldly wealth, the corrupt doctrines, and the internal divisions that act as a moat defending the anti-Christian kingdom.
And finally, we landed on Edward's pastoral call, stressing the immediate, tangible value of urgent prayer, regardless of when the final trumpet actually sounds.
Edwards leaves us with a framework that balances intense historical awareness with present-day spiritual zeal. He teaches us that analyzing prophecy should never lead to passive speculation. It should always lead back to our knees.
Absolutely.
So as we wrap up this deep dive, I want to ask you, the listener, to consider how your own view of the future impacts your daily spiritual life. Are you waiting passively, treating the return of Christ like a save-the-date card stuck on the fridge for an event years away?
Or are you praying with urgency, like a family waiting for an imminent arrival?
Do your expectations of tomorrow dictate your obedience today?
And here is a final thought to mull over as you go about your week. Edwards identified the removal of divisions and contentions among Protestants as a key prophetic step in preparing the highway for Christ.
That is such a huge point.
He saw unity among believers not just as a nice, polite idea, but as the literal drying up of a massive defensive moat that protects the enemy's kingdom.
If unity among believers is the actual mechanism that dries up the enemy's defenses, how should that alter the way we handle theological disagreements today? Think back to that pregnant mother waiting for the baby to arrive any second.
She's definitely not arguing.
No, she isn't standing in the hallway arguing bitterly with her husband about the color of the nursery curtains. She is entirely focused on the arrival. Perhaps our constant, bitter theological squabbles over secondary issues are simply the luxury of a church that secretly believes the train is still 3 weeks away.
That's the challenging thought.
Let the expectation of the future fuel your prayers and your pursuit of unity today. Thank you for joining us on this deep dive.